Please subscribe, like, and hit that notification bell. Thanks, guys.
Sorry, guys. Got it? There you go. So, Kev, you want to do the intro? Or it's...
Yep, I'll do the intro. Okay, guys, it's Kevin Wadsworth and Patrick Crim, NorthStarBadCharts.com, of course. And we're bringing back a guest that we've spoken to before more than once. Great guest, David Murrin, here in the UK with me as well. And great political commentator, putting his views and opinions on exactly where we're going with investments and where we're going with the world at large generally. So it's not looking too great. I think the last time I spoke to you, David, we were talking about Russia and Ukraine, and now, of course, we've got another complete disaster unfolding in front of our eyes in the Middle East there. So to me, it feels like a really nasty situation that we're getting ourselves into, to put it very mildly. So what's your take on where things are?
Well, I think you summed it up really. It is pretty nasty. It's great to be back with you again, Kevin and Pat. So thanks for having me back. I think it's really worth sort of putting the big picture on this to understand in the largest degree what's happening to us in our society, which is, I would argue, the last stage of the Western Christian empire, and America being the last of the empires as such of that system, and being in terminal decline. And the result of that is seeing a man called Biden do everything possible to finish off the policies of Obama, which weakened America and American foreign policy, the policies of appeasement, and they've all come home to roost in one man's presidency. And not just himself, but also his administration, which seemed to have continued the same damn policies as Obama without any assessment of how successful they were, whether it was failing to contain the Chinese into the second island chain and their island building program, or sending 3 Hercules full of cash into the Iranians' hands, trying to stop them from going nuclear, and all they did was spend the money in Yemen to create another war. So lessons not learned coming home to roost, and weakness and appeasement, really creating this paradigm that we've seen time and time again of essentially predatory human behavior in the form of dictatorships, perceiving this as weakness, planning to make their move, and then making their move. Now, the catalyst of it all is this thing that we've talked about, the K-wave cycle. It's Kondratiev cycle, but it isn't just about inflation. I would take that a stage further and describe it as an entropic surge that goes through humanity. And that surge is what reshuffles the deck and encourages challengers to make their move. And we are in the final years into that peak where everything starts to unfold in front of us. And then the other cycle is interesting, is this perennial struggle between that we've seen from the Napoleonic era. And I should describe a thing called hegemonic wars. They're the biggest wars where one system is challenged by a rising another system. And then for a period afterwards, usually about 100 years or so, you end up with Pax America or Pax Britannica, and everyone benefits and grows under that trading relationship. And we are at the end of Pax America, and we're seeing that reshuffle. And we're seeing a hegemonic conflict which personifies democracy and enablement of the individual versus autocracy and the sublimation of the individual to a collective, with a pyramid and a sharp point. And that's what you're seeing, this axis of autocracy that's only happening because the Chinese are there. If the Chinese weren't there, these other elements, North Korea, Iran, Russia, wouldn't have the strength to stand alone. But they're doing it in front of this big machine that's making its challenge. And there's coherence in this, whether it's Russia and its relationship with China before Ukraine was invaded, whether it's Iran, Russia, linked to China and Hamas. This is all connected, and it's part of the drumbeat and the shift as we go into this peak. And as you quite rightly say, one by one, these sequence and decks of cards are happening to us, and they appear to be separate, but they are not. They're coherent, based on decline of America, the entropic surge, weakness and appeasement, and predatory human behavior. And it goes to only one place, which is Taiwan and the whole Asian conflict flaring up, which it's inevitably going to do. And then everyone will call it World War III. But the truth is we've been in it since the invasion of Ukraine, and probably in it actually since the pandemic was released and the West decided not to actually call it what it was, which was attack on our society, call it some sort of random event and continue to appease our way through the process.
I was about to bring that up, actually, because whilst you've been talking about that, when, I mean, obviously, Pat and I are technical chart analysts, and at the time in early 2020 into 2021, it became very clear, looking at key charts, particularly the bond charts and the bond yields, that something really very major was taking place in the world's financial markets, and there was a rotation taking place and a move away from what we've seen since the 1980s, a 40-year pattern that had formed on the technical charts, and a breakout duly followed with bond yields breaking out, and watching the way capital's been rotating from commodities, I should say from the stock markets towards commodities, towards hard assets, towards precious metals, that a lot of people actually haven't even really cottoned onto yet, and it's in its relatively early stages. But all of that kind of ties in with what you're describing in terms of the geopolitics. And so the geopolitics and the technical chart analysis and the stocks and the shares and the precious metals and commodities, they kind of all go hand in hand. But there's a very, very clear cutoff point around about the time of the COVID pandemic, which is very, very clear on all of the technical charts. But the question I was going to ask you really at the end of all of that is that, we've got this huge rotation taking place, and, the repercussions out there in the real world in terms of global conflict and the conjunctive cycle and the fourth turning and all these things that have been spoken about for many, many years, that a lot of people have kind of not really believed fully, and is now really coming so sort of in your face that it's very hard to deny it. So how do you see, do you see mankind actually, do you see us getting out to the end of this without destroying the entirety of human civilization, without being too dramatic about it? What do you think the probabilities are that we have some sort of I don't want to call it a mass extinction event, but I'm talking about the use of nuclear weapons killing millions or hundreds of millions or even billions of people. How much of a threat, how much of a risk do you think that is?
Well, when I wrote Breaking the Code of History, I described this decade as a decade of consciousness or catastrophe.
Yeah.
And the problem that we have, and the theories I've worked on, are the basis of, we create empire systems because they're collective organisms that have anti-entropy, that push back the entropy of the universe so we can live in them more successfully. And when that system becomes sequestered and old, we have another war where a challenging system gets to go and challenge the old and knock it aside, and it becomes stronger and it makes a new peak. So the simple, brutal truth is humanity is interwoven with war that we use to strengthen ourselves, enhance our adaptability, and build bigger, stronger anti-entropic systems. But the trouble with that, as you quite rightly touched upon, what happens when your unconscious survival evolutionary habit touches upon weapon systems that destroy everything? And we are into that war. We're into it right now. Now, I think there is a vast inhibition to use nuclear weapons, not just because when in the Cold War we came out of the Second World War, but because if you look at animals in the animal kingdom, when they rut, they don't kill each other, they wound each other sufficiently that one dominates the other and the other disappears. It's a form of ritualization in that process, which then doesn't detract from the gene pool. I think that's quite heavily coded into us as a human race. And I think that the Chinese especially want to inherit the world, and they want to enforce this dominant process as CCP stands for, eradicate democracy, and they believe that they have the right to inherit the world. So to endanger the world is not actually in their DNA. And to endanger the world in the West is not in our DNA because we're old and decrepit. So there's a degree of standoff, but I do think the war we are in is going to last at least a decade. And to give a perspective of how severe this process is, if you look at the Kondratiev cycle, there are conflicts at every peak, but every other peak is a hegemonic peak. Two titanic systems struggling for the way of dominance into the future. And it took, for example, from 1799 to 1815, that's 16 years for the Napoleonic Wars. And in fact, we were at war with them beforehand, but not under the whole Republic and Napoleon's control. And Napoleon was dictatorial by nature versus a slightly more liberal system in the rest of Europe. You look at the First World War was the beginning of the next hegemonic struggle. And actually, the First and Second World War were part 1 and part 2. And that took from 14 to 45, 30 years. So what we're entering into is not just a quick 4 years or 5 years, heaven forbid. It is, if we're lucky, it's a decade. If we're not, it's over a period of 2 decades or 3 decades. It's an immense struggle that we face. And I think as China makes its move, it is not in a position to dominate the world immediately. It may well push out America from the second island chain with the mass use of rocketry and hypersonic weapons in a surprise attack. And the Americans may not be able to get it back in there, but they've still got to come out for the rest of the world. And the building programs that go with building a navy that can do that would take them 5, 6, 7 years. So it's a long, drawn-out process we face.
It kind of feels, though, to me, sort of viewing from, you know, the comfort of the UK here, if you want to put it that way, looking at what's going on around the world in, you know, all these conflict hotspots, and also to an extent, you know, with our leadership here in the UK and in the United States, and is that our leaders, global leaders, thought leaders, political leaders, do not represent anybody that I know with what they're doing here. When I strike up conversations with people about what's going on in the Middle East or Ukraine, or, you know, Ukraine-Russia conflict, that nobody seems to agree that their leader is doing what they would wish them to do. You know, it's hard to find anybody in the UK that thinks, you know, that funding what is happening out in the Middle East effectively with taxpayers' money is something they want to see being done, given the way it's being done and the awful impacts that it's having, you know, on innocent human life out there. And it does, you know, I struggle to find anyone anywhere that really strongly supports what's going on in either of those conflicts with our support for conflict overseas, effectively, and our provision of weaponry. And, you know, it's funny when you talk to women as well, and you talk to, you know, you start striking up conversations with your wife or your wife's, you know, friends and that kind of thing. They always say this would never happen if women were in charge, if women were in power. And I sort of thought about that for a moment. I thought, well, hang on a minute, probably right. There's something warmongering about, you know, male society. And, you know, is it a testosterone thing? Is it a macho thing? Is it something that's built into us all? But it just seems like I just want to stop stop the world. You know, number one, our leader, my leader, our leader in the UK, they're not representing what I want. And I don't know anybody that thinks that Rishi Sunak actually represents them. You know, and I don't know if, you know, I get the impression it's the same in many countries.
No,
I was just like, what the hell's going on?
Well, you've touched on lots of things. First of all, if you were to look at human monsters that, you know, have caused human suffering on an epic scale, they're all men. Women haven't perhaps aren't, but I think you touched upon something that is really quite interesting about this predatory male persona that you can see from Mao to Putin to Xi to Stalin to Hitler. And, you know, we need to understand better as a human race when these people start coming along, just how dangerous they are when they get to power. And the problem is that we all project onto others who we are. And most people fit in the norm of behavior, that the idea of going to war with another nation is actually out of their boundaries of thought. So they discount it when they see someone else's rhetoric. We need to be far more realistic about it and realize the only thing that stops them is force and deterrence at the appropriate time, not denial. And that's the first thing. I think the issue of women and war is really sensitive. I've had a few metaphoric black eyes like swung at me across the table, but I've also think that it is very important that women become more aware of what conflict represents, because their children are sent off to war to fight it. And it's not good enough to just say we don't believe in it, we don't want it, because every mother in history has said the same thing before losing their children to conflict. So greater education and self-responsibility amongst women, I think, is really important. And the key thing is that deterrence and strong deterrence is your safest avenue in the face of predatory, aggressive behavior. You know, you can't talk to it, you can't appease it, you can't say, I've got children, have you? Basically, strength is all they understand. So we failed again in the liberal society to see that. And Sunak represents and Biden represent linear thought processes which are appeasing. And so they're viewed as the roebuck that can't jump on the African plains by the lions looking at them. And even if we do things like send money to Ukraine, we still look weak when we can't defend our own territory, and Russian submarines can get into the North Sea, or, you know, we're constantly assailed by them. So the failure of deterrence is huge. I think we are now beyond the point of choice. We only have one choice: to identify how dangerous it is, and actually to man up and spend money and create deterrence and strengthen our system, and hope through that strength we can just at the last minute deter it by showing that we're strong enough to resist. And if we don't, it's inevitable what comes, that the predators have set their play up and they will enact their plays, as Iran did through Hamas. I would argue that China and Russia were well aware of what was going on through Iran, and as she is doing over Taiwan and the Asian basin. It's a really sad time.
David, I had this thought that goes, if you had to redraw the world borders after this conflict ends, Is there anything that's going to shock me? Is the border of Canada going to shrink? Are the US going to lose some territories?
Okay.
Did you ever imagine how it would look like the world borders?
No, funnily enough, I've been doing a massive piece of work which looks at the First World War as a hegemonic war and how the financial system went through it, and then the Second World War as part two, but with other elements of hegemony. And the first thing you notice is scope. So the First World War was a seven years war in sort of 1750s. That was global, and the Napoleon War was pretty global too. But once the Royal Navy got control of the oceans, it became continental. That's what happened in the First World War, and ultimately what happened to the European theatres of the Atlantic. The same way, our navies dominated. It was contained in the continent. It became continental, and then you've got to add on a Pacific conflict with another agency causing war. Well, if you look at that process of scope, this war is going everywhere, right? The CCP I really think that their view is war against every form of democracy and human individuality. There are no exceptions, and those people that think they can hide underneath the dragon's belly will just get crushed. So if the Chinese could do it, they'd go everywhere. And if we can do it, we'll contain them into the Asian continent with Russia, and that's where the war will take place. But
when you say the Chinese, this is something that always intrigues me. Are you talking about the hundreds of millions of Chinese people, or are you talking about the much smaller number of Chinese authoritarian figures and political leaders?
Right now, let's talk about a president called Xi, who basically taking control of the CCP.
It's what fascinates me is that we talk about the Chinese or the Americans or the Ukrainians or the Russians as though it's one homogenous, the views of their leader is the views of everybody, and that's what always kind of amazes me is that the views and opinions and policies of a relatively small number, a minority, lead us into all of this catastrophe, and the majority who have differing views don't have a say in the matter. And I just find it fascinating that that's the world that we live in.
But
we're not learning.
No, but your observation is spot on, Kevin. And there's a theory about human collective organization that I've written that describes just the phenomena you talked about. And if you took a spectrum of 100, I'd say you've got sort of 30% who are lateral, of which half of them maybe don't have the IQ to power the outcomes in peace, but they're great corporals and sergeants in war. And then you've got a group of them who are productive. And on the other side, you've got this malevolent force that have capabilities to lead, but they go down the dark plug hole. And in the middle, you've got a 70% population that are effectively like wheat, and they literally get blown on one side or the other, depending on who's in power. And so the concentration of leadership genes and leadership decisions is actually very narrow, and they determine what happens to the body in the middle. And the body in the middle may have opinions, but it can't echo them, can't exercise them. They're usually quite collective, to be honest, and they follow rather than preempt. And that's a differentiation. And I think our human system could change if more people understood how they were thinking and sought to change that. But for now, we've ended up in the same old paradigm as running into 1914 or any of these great conflicts, completely in denial, completely sort of shocked, and with leadership that's intrinsically weak. And that is our greatest Achilles heel.
I was always wondering, what's the chicken and the egg? So let's say you have the leader, like the guy's a psychopath. He wants to bring people to war. But then after that, there's the military complex, which, there's an opportunity to make some money, we'll print, and then it feeds into that. Who's the egg? Is it some secret type of group of military complex that whispers in the ears of the egomaniac, says, hey, we should do a war there? Like, do you have a theory on
yeah, I do. That's a new twist on Davos Man. When people say to me the world's controlled by Davos Man, I say, have you met these people? They couldn't organize a paper bag and their way out of it, yet alone take control of the world secretly. So I would argue that we are a huge living social organism. And this collective energy that creates the cycle, which is a up and down hump in organization, is an unconscious dynamic. And so the first portion, the system usually manifests quite linear leadership. And then there's a civil war where lateralization, which is always successful in war, overcomes linearity. And the system becomes highly expansive. And the population growth underneath now has leadership that can take it to expand. So strangely enough, systems bring leaders that they need to enact their cycle at a given time. So the system actually manifests different leadership. And a good example of in extension, when you expand, there's a sense of collective service. So people are, they're serving themselves because they've got egos, no doubt about it, but they are serving themselves like Nelson served his nation, ultimately with his life in his decisions. But when you start to go down, as we've seen since 9/11, in fact, service disappears and it's all about self over system. So narcissism becomes rampant. Hence, we've had like a covert narcissist in Obama, an overt narcissist in Trump. We've had good old Boris get all narcissistic on us. It's everywhere. And for those people that sit at the top, believe me, the corporate world is full of the same personas. So that's a process of manifestation rather than someone putting them in place. And our problem is trying to understand that service is leadership and finding someone. Funny enough, I think Sunak does think he serves the people. It's just he's so limited in his horizons and weak of personality that he's completely the wrong person. He's just a good technocrat, works hard, but that isn't what you need at times like this. You need bold leadership with great sense of service and vision, and there are none of those available in the West, which is why we're steering into our brick wall at breakneck speed.
What about Trudeau? He's great. What are you talking about?
Oh man, well, he's just a member of the Lucky Sperm Club, right?
Goodness. All right, we just got canceled, Kevin. That's it for our show. Got canceled. Goodness.
Oh, well, it was okay while it lasted, wasn't it?
Well,
It was great. Sorry, boys.
look, I had a thought there a while back. I'm tired of self-censoring myself. They got me in this thing that when I was young, anything I get in trouble at school because I would just blather stuff out.
Pat, I can't imagine you censoring yourself at all. If this is a censored version, God help me.
Yeah. I could at parties there. It's like I make on purpose, like to instigate stuff, and do those racist jokes. That's me, do those inappropriate.
It's a good thing jokes. We weren't recording a few minutes ago.
Oh goodness, I love doing those jokes. It relieves attention. It's jokes. It's like, let's have fun. But now you do that on YouTube, I know the algorithm going to start picking up on stuff and whatever.
There's a really interesting thing about the Anglophile black humor, which I think is so important. If you can't laugh at the most sacred processes, then you become rigid and fixed. So it sort of creates fluidity in thought. But it also has another purpose. And there's a great little story of these guys, these paratroopers at Goose Green in the Falklands, and they're being mortared. And the mortaring stops, and there's this shouting voice saying, "I've lost my leg, I've lost my beep leg." And there's a pause, and there's a voice from the other foxhole, and he says, "No, you haven't, mate, it's over here." And the guy who had lost his leg started laughing in real life. And
well, that's trench humor, isn't it? I mean, if you don't laugh, what are you going to do?
Going into shock, and he survived.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
There's an element of truth in that, and you can take political correctness a little bit too far, although I can understand why you have to be sensitive to people's feelings, but in a situation like that, it's completely different.
I think respect, Kevin, is the most important human condition. Is that
yeah.
we live in a society where we're allowed to be different, be respectful, but if someone wishes to argue their point, if they're not logical, you are able to prosecute the lack of logic in the discussion, and that may be difficult for them, but that still can be respectful.
Yes. Yeah, 100% agree. When I read stuff on Twitter and I see that the logic's all broken, I go crazy inside.
Twitter's really, I mean, it's a weird form of communication. Short bursts of provocative prose that somehow are meant to, provide education, or it's, I think, a flawed medium, full stop.
Well, it's interesting that if you try and actually talk in a reasonable way on Twitter and be reasonable and thoughtful and allow other people's views and opinions without getting too upset, it's almost received with surprise. It's kind of, everybody expects you to be angry and bitter and sort of at their throat the whole time. And I've been guilty of it myself. I'm not going to say that I'm completely innocent to that. You get kind of drawn into it and you're kind of very defensive on Twitter. And it's not representative of a lot of people's personalities. You meet them in the street, they're perfectly normal, lovely people, but put them in front of Twitter, and suddenly they turn into keyboard warriors, trying to stab you in the back the whole time. Whoa!
You touched on something that I think is really interesting. Is that watershed moment when COVID came along, and you saw negative oil, And then we saw the surge in commodities that finally represents this sort of 5-year C wave of the K wave. And everything's changed with that. And one of the things that I think is interesting is that because we exported all our manufacturing to China from 2000 onwards, we suppressed inflation through manufacturing more cheaply in a time when actually inflation should have been consistently moving higher and bond rates should have been higher. And so this artificial construct of taking your whole industrial base and putting it into another country is quite anomalous. And it means that where we are now without volte-facing yields, and the Fed thinks that it's all under control, there's only one thing that matters is the oil price. And the oil price is poised for its next big surge as it inflames in the Middle East. And everything else is secondary in that process. And it was like that in the 70s. And
it's an interesting point, that, Dave, because I read a lot on Twitter that folks are now very convinced that bond yields are heading back down, and sustainably so. And my view on that is that, well, we're in a different paradigm here. Things have changed. We could see, or we are highly likely to see, bond yields pulling back to, I don't know, 2.5%, 3%, say. But we are now, in my view, in a different era, and I expect bond yields to remain elevated and quite likely to begin climbing again after the next pullback. I mean, what are your views on that? I mean, obviously in the 1970s, we saw bond yields climbing up to into double figures, beyond 10%, 15% over many years, and of course, it's only been a couple of years that we've seen this move to 5%. How do you see that panning out over the next few years?
You couldn't have put it better. Essentially, if you take that last K wave peak into 75, you had 15% CPI and 15% 10-year rates and 22 Fed funds. And that's the minimum place we're going to. But there's something worse than that in terms of, if you go and look at the state of, by all the metrics I use for empire strength of Britain going into the war in 1914, essentially we were bust by 1917, and we still had a trading route, we still had trading systems feeding us, and we still went right to the edge. And if it hadn't been for America as a deep financial reserve, we wouldn't have made it. And then in 1939, our empire was bigger because we'd assimilated the Middle East, but we were far more fragile, and we only lasted until 1941 before the Americans, or 40 before the Americans really came in to support us. Well, America is weaker in terms of its position, sensitivity financially than Britain was into 39. And so as you move into this threshold of conflict, one thing I can guarantee you is that bond yields are going to go through the roof, because bond issuance just will become massive with a war through the funding requirements. And even if you can go and create war bond constructs from the public, before you get there, yields will have completely changed in paradigm. And so I think arms race does it, and certainly we're in that, and conflict does it overnight. And what's interesting is that there's a sense of denial about that. And in 1914, although the equity market started to fall about a month beforehand and could see it, bond markets just sat there placidly thinking, not much had changed. And then suddenly they repriced. So I see something very similar happening to us right now, especially because the real element, the acceleration, is a surprise attack from China, which will have no signaling. There'll be no, we're coming for you. It'll be much more surprise orientated than Pearl Harbor, even, because of the weapon systems they've created. So I think there's enormous risk up ahead financially. And as you've done with your work, gold and silver is a really great place. It's ready to rock. I mean, gold's looking like it's going through 2,100 like a knife through butter anytime soon. And the issue there is what happens to the dollar too. And if I'm right about hegemonic decline, the dollar is definitely going to suffer from that. And repatriation surges, I think, will be very limited, because if you lose your revenue base through just 5% of the dollar's distribution on the margin where the empire's old, that's a huge kick in the system. So I think we're into that too.
So rising bond yields over the long term, gold and silver rising over the long term. This is something that, in the early stages a couple of years ago, a lot of people couldn't wrap their heads around. Bond yields and interest rates going up and gold and silver going up. There seemed to be this narrative going around that, you need falling bond yields to have, gold and silver doing well. I took a step back and thought, well, over the last 40 years, when bond yields have gone from 16% to 0%, really, gold and silver haven't done anything spectacular, in the grand scheme of things. Gold has been, up to $2,000 a couple of times, but it's not sort of moved on to whole new levels over the last 40 years that you might have perhaps expected. So, you know, if your argument is that falling bond yields is good for gold, well, the evidence really isn't there for that, and you only have to look a lot. And this is the other thing that really annoys me. A lot of people do their analysis looking back 10 or 15 years and say, because this has happened in the last 10 or 15 years, this is what's going to happen in the next. Oh, hang on a minute, history goes back a bit further than that. The charts go back a lot further than that. You know, you can get charts on the S&P that go back 100 years. You know, so hang on a minute, look at the full evidence here, and then start drawing some conclusions. And if you happen to look at the 1970s, oh, by the way, that, you know, that was the biggest, you know, bull market for gold and silver. It was also the biggest market for bond yields. So, you know, go back and think again.
And that's the analogy we're in. We're in that, hey, well, if we stay cold and this doesn't get worse, we're in that analogy anyway. If we go hot, we're into a completely different paradigm of how does the Western financial system, already indebted, survive funding a massive program of armament and a wartime economy. None of it looks good, and I think there's sort of no way out of it. But you've got bond, you know, like 2-year yields. You can see it on a chart. They look like they're bottomed. You can see everyone getting really excited. This is the moment. This is the turn, because people still want to believe the Fed have control. They want to believe that this inflationary surge was just a surge and it's all over and it returns to normal. And normal for them is money printing mania. And that's
so two things I just want you to comment on before I forget: central bank digital currencies and crypto. What do you think of those two?
So I love Bitcoin, you know, in terms of a trading medium. It's my favorite. It's got more unconscious patterns than anything anywhere. So, you know, I was able to get the 66 drop to 18, go long at 18, been long ever since on Bitcoin. I think it's time to focus on Bitcoin and not the plethora of other cryptos. This is a safe haven play. And we're on the way to 100 to 120. And it should be viewed as a store of alternative security in a world.
And do you see central bank digital currencies as any kind of a threat to that? Any sort of likelihood of central governments and central banks sort of making it hard for Bitcoin and, you know, their own digital currencies being pushed?
Look, I think, again, they're so slow to do anything that, you know, nothing ever happens quickly in the world of central banks. And long before they can really do anything, we're going to be in a wartime paradigm, in my opinion. And then you really got to think about, you know, it's not just about interference in crypto, it's an interference in every aspect of not being able to raise corporate capital. It's happened in the First World War, of basically trying to direct capital into the war effort through funding bonds and making rules that do it. We're going to see a completely free markets will disappear, and you'll get semi-free trading in a lattice of government controls designed to keep the whole system afloat in conflict. So way before we get to that stage, we're going to have bigger issues. And understanding how they might come about is really quite an interesting discussion in its own right.
You're giving us a lot of choices for the title for this podcast, I've got to say, Dave, because I'm thinking Bitcoin to 100,000. I'm thinking China to attack. I'm thinking conjunctive cycle to create chaos. You know, yeah, we're going to have plenty of options.
We could call it the shit's hitting the fan.
Yeah, that's pretty much cutting to the chase, isn't it? Yeah.
David, before I need to get your thoughts on this. It's a little tangent there. Is it China's or Russia or whatever is their goal to take over territory? Like, is it possible that one day Australia is just a province of China? Is that?
Yeah, it is to the CCP. And you've really got to sort of get your head into, this is an autocratic hierarchical structure of the degree the world's never really seen. And it's supplanted now, or it's supported by AI programs. That means you as an individual make a funny face on your phone and you're found out. There's nowhere to hide. You could hide in France against German occupation somewhere. We can't. And that's why they control their people totally. Now that gives them the idea that not only do they have to eradicate Western freedoms, they can now control Western societies. They can dominate them with systems like that. So I think we really are into a struggle of, yes, Australia would be on their target list. It's a massive provider of metals and coal. So it's a strategic resource, but most importantly, it's like the aircraft carrier Britain was in Europe to American blow of arms in the Second World War. And that's what AUKUS is really about, is establishing a relationship that lets Australia become the fight back center where America can fight back into lost territory as it did in the Second World War after the Japanese expansion. So yes, every piece of territory is ultimately up for grabs. There are no complacent places. And, you know, but as happened in the Second World War, it takes time to fully mobilize societies in this industry to really turn it into a, literally making everything it can. And even more so because the time it takes to make a tank is 3-4 times longer than it was then. They're sophisticated pieces of technology. So the game's going to be longer. It's going to be a most horrendous struggle. I think we have not done a good job in Ukraine. I think Jake Sullivan and co. only gave the Ukrainians enough to hold on. They knew exactly what they did. They never gave them the tools to win. They've done better than you imagine with the limited tools. And now there's a stalemate. And that stalemate doesn't favor Ukraine because it's a smaller population and it can't take the same casualty ratios. It's 1/6 smaller than Russia. So we've lost time that we could have used to make us stronger. We can't even make enough shells for them. And the Israelis now taken some of the supplies that would have gone there. So we haven't responded very well. And sadly, the lives bought by the Ukrainians haven't been used to strengthen our position. We've just been more exposed as weaker.
I want some good news.
I was going to say, can we end on a positive note at all?
I think this is really important. And people say, David is such a pessimist. How do you live with it? Actually, I'm incredibly optimistic. I love life. I live it to the full. I realize how privileged we are to live in this generation. And so sometimes when you're faced with difficult news, you want to avoid the difficult news. The best thing you can do is face up to what's happening, so accept it, because then you can start learning how to adapt to it. And once you learn to adapt to it, you can survive it. I do think the future is that democracy dominates over autocracy for a whole host of reasons. But it's a struggle that we've made harder for ourselves, and we've exposed ourselves through our complacency. And the quicker we wake up, the quicker we might deter it at the last minute, or basically not lose, which is about as optimistic as I can be at this stage.
Okay, well, not losing is probably a good place to draw to close, I think, because we are definitely on a high point there. It's the highest point I think we've reached so far.
And the other thing too is, as you look at markets, and the way I do in terms of behavioral patterns and price, these different systems, but it's still, they're incredibly powerful arbiters of collective behavior. And it's no coincidence that I can see my geopolitical models, which are derivatives, which are not price-based but behavior-based, interlocking with this complex global macro picture, which is all coming together in all time frames. And when that happens, you have to take it really seriously. And many of my clients want to know how to survive and what to do with it, which is all you can do, make decisions which are appropriate. And those decisions rest in precious metals and Bitcoin. Depends how adventurous you are. You don't be long of equities, but you can be long of some individual equities like defense stocks or iron and steel mills, because there are so few of them left outside China. There are lots of exciting things to do as an investor if you can get your head around the difficulty we go through. So keep your eye on the prize.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. Keep your eye on the prize is a good tagline to end on, I suppose. But thanks for all the sobering information there. I think it's it's a dose of truth that we all need to hear for sure. Any closing comments there, Pat?
Well, no, thanks for coming, David. It's I'm sure a lot of people will be interested to see where they could get more of your work. So if you don't mind sharing that.
Yeah, please just go to the site, davidmurrin.co.uk, murrin.co.uk. You can access it through various levels. There's a global forecaster piece, which is where all of the geopolitical perspectives and predictions I've talked about are available. That's really quite reasonably priced, considering it's investment grade. And then for those of you that are professional investors, then there's a whole higher level. There's a hedge fund access, in effect, where you can access our hedge fund's activity with specific buys, entry points, risk allocations, which has proven to be hugely alpha generative. They also have a really exciting strategy for investment through conflict, which is you won't see anywhere else available. And for those of you that are not involved in markets, we also do some work with the military, all over the place, in terms of how to adapt businesses and organizations in an environment like this. There's a great piece which we have called Adaptation Through Lateralization, which basically takes away the synthesis of war's lateralized society, make them more productive and adaptive. But what happens if you could do that voluntarily and turn your system or your society or your organization into be more adaptive, which you need to go through this? And there's some great mechanisms we've created to do that, and had some really exciting results. Really exciting. So think, be adaptive, think adaptively, be open, and try and put your fear on hold and just deal with what you've got in front of you.
Awesome. We'll put all the links, guys, in the description. David, it's fun. Maybe we should catch up again in a few months there and see how stuff evolves.
We'll wait till another war breaks out and then we'll.
Yeah, I'm afraid you just wheel me out to go and put people in the box of depression. But you know, the thing is, none of this is a surprise, and all of this is I've been writing about already. So it's not a sort of a commentary post. It's actually.
I remember from some of our early discussions, as you say, exactly. This isn't any kind of a shock for those that have been paying close attention.
And you've been paying close attention. So you know, much as it's depressing hearing that out of my lips, I suspect that there's nothing new there. You reading your work, guys. So thank you for the opportunity to chat. It's always a pleasure.
Yes.
I promise you, we can have a conversation about something completely different if you want.
Yes. We could talk about hockey there. Wayne Gretzky, Mario Lemieux. Like,
did you see the hockey player, the guy that got his throat cut?
Yes. Well.
Oh, that was nasty.
Yeah, I remember the original one in '89, Clint Malarchuk, and it's like, thank goodness we didn't have HD back then, because I just remember it was it was red on the ice there. It was just so horrific.
Well, a really good friend of mine who's been playing ice hockey, like everything I know him, got smacked in the mouth and lost all his teeth. And years with dental repair. It's got some brutal angles, a brutal game, but great to watch.
Great to watch.
We could talk about the rugby.
Rugby. Don't mention the rugby.
Well, actually, I think the rugby is really interesting. I did a whole piece on how rugby is ritualized conflict, in effect, and has an awful lot of parallels between two systems fighting, and the entropic outcomes. And the reason why you find games like that so fascinating is they emulate this conflict dynamic that's imbued within us.
Yeah. Well, football's full of that tribalism. Football is a very tribal game, or soccer as you might call it in the States, but it's very, very tribalized.
Yeah, but the fighting happens off the pitch in soccer, whereas in rugby happens on the pitch.
You obviously haven't been to my local football club, but yeah.
Those elbows have been sharpened, have they, Kevin?
Yeah, we'll keep that for another interview. But no, it's been great. It's been great having you with us, David. Yes. We always appreciate it.
I love speaking to you guys. Thank you for the privilege of being here.
Thanks a lot, Dave.
Lovely weekend. Take care.
Until next time. Yeah, bye-bye.
Bye.
Please subscribe, like, and hit that notification bell. Thanks, guys.